Hello, I'm Leonard Golub. I'm a financial advisor with New Capital Management here in Houston, Texas. We are a registered investment advisor that has $300 million under management. And I am here today with our colleague and friend, Michael Sanchez, who is an attorney in his own private practice here in Houston. And we wanted to try to do a segment for the public focused on legal and financial considerations in the wake of Hurricane and Tropical Storm Harvey, which hit Houston on August the 25th. We're making this video on September the 19th, so it's almost a month since the disaster. And I think the first thing that I want to say is we are so sorry, and our hearts go out to everybody who's been impacted by this tragedy. It is an incomprehensible, virtually, disaster. Many people continue to recover. There are still some people still in shelters. And we hope that everybody is on the way to healing and repairing their homes and their families and getting back to work. So we wanted to start with that. We wanted to use our joint expertise in finance and in accounting and in law. Michael is a CPA and an attorney, has an MBA. I'm a CFA, a Chartered Financial Analyst, and an MBA, and we wanted to see if we could bring some value to the discussion. We know that many people are well along in the claims and remediation process, but if we can bring any additional value to that picture, then we'd like to do that. So welcome, Michael. It's good to see you. I think the first place I want to start is to point out both of our situations. We're both homeowners in Houston. I did not flood. My home is located in Houston's Museum District. Michael, you did flood, so I thought we would start today talking about that. Maybe you'd give the viewers your personal experience and what you've gone through to get us off and going.
Sure, that's great. Leonard, thank you so much.
Great to have you, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me here today. As you rightly pointed out, my wife and I, unfortunately, were flood victims. We have lived in Bel Air for about 17 years. We moved into the area because it was a great, nice area. We thought at the time, of course, that the area would be safe from flooding. And it's so interesting because people, when they go into a community and buy, one of the things that they rarely spend a lot of time on is its propensity to flood. Yes, we gave some consideration to it early on. We said, well, this area is in what at the time was a 100-year floodplain. Well, unfortunately, we've encountered a flood 3 times since we moved into the house. So the opportunity to be here today to impart just a few nuggets that we think might be beneficial to those that are in the throes of wherever they may be. They may be in the process of completing a proof of loss form. They may find themselves uninsured. They may find themselves trying to find contractors. There's just a plethora of issues that people who have been affected by the flood are facing. Just a couple of words about my background. As you mentioned, I am an attorney, CPA and MBA. My background is largely, or was in my early stages of my career with publicly traded companies. I managed large corporate tax departments and focused a lot of my time and energy on mergers and acquisitions, business transactions. And then later in my career, decided to shift gears and have a second or even third career.
Go small.
Right, go small. And I have to tell you that it's been extremely rewarding because it gives me the opportunity to work more closely with people as opposed to working with corporate entities. Not that that's a bad thing, but certainly I gain a lot of satisfaction from helping people, and hopefully, as a result of our discussion today, we'll touch on a few things that will help some folks.
So, how's your house coming along? And maybe you'll tell us about how much damage it sustained and what your personal experience is. Maybe just a couple of minutes so that people can identify with where you're at in the process versus where they may be at in the process.
Yes, absolutely. Well, our situation is that we have an older home in Bel Air. It was built in the late 40s, actually 1950 now that I think about it. But its elevation is a little lower to the flood level plain than or relative to a lot of the newer homes. As I mentioned earlier, we moved into the house with the expectation that we wouldn't see a drop of water in the house. But our experience has been we were affected by the Allison storm. We were affected by the Memorial Day storm.
Did you take water in both of those flood events?
We did.
Uh-huh.
And of course, we took in water as a result of Harvey. And what's happened over time is that the severity of the level of water has increased with each event. And I know our discussion is not about the causes of that, but the reality is that I think my situation is not a lot unlike other people who are in homes that are maybe older homes, a little lower to the ground. And of course, what's happened during that time, Leonard, is that people have come into the communities and built larger homes. The community is just changing. We can talk about the causes, but and one of those might be just increased development, less green space, less place for the water to run, surrounding properties that are elevated higher. But our experience has been that we now have come to realize that we have to anticipate that flooding is a potential. Where we are in the process, to answer your question, is we are now in the throes of dealing with 4 particular claims. And a lot of people don't think about having to segment claims, but that's the reality. For example, my wife's car took on water. That's an auto claim. We had damage from a flood to the dwelling. That's a flood claim. We had damage to the ceiling as a result of water that was blown through the shingles and seeped down into the top part of the house. That's covered by private insurance. And then the third claim, which we'll talk about later, relates to the potential to have to bring our house or to elevate it. Some people refer to that sort of tongue-in-cheek as a raise and raise requirement, meaning under certain circumstances, some of the older homes may be required to be either demolished, elevated, or brought into compliance with floodplain requirements that are mandated by FEMA and their particular city or township, depending on which part of town you live in.
And we're going to talk about that, the relationship between FEMA and your town, and maybe give people a little bit of insight into how that arrangement works and why maybe they should know at least a little bit about that, and
Sure.
and why that's such an important relationship and a driver of their options.
It is indeed, Leonard. You're right. There is an important relationship between FEMA, which many viewers know is the federal government agency that's charged with the responsibility to go out and help people in crisis and disaster needs. And of course, they are the agency charged with administering the National Flood Insurance Program, which is vital to our community now.
Yeah. And so really you're suggesting that the first thing that everybody is likely doing is separating out their claims and organizing their claims into categories.
That's exactly right. And the reason for doing that, Leonard, is I think what would be beneficial for folks to understand is that there are certain items of property that may not be covered under a particular policy or even within a certain coverage element within a policy, and yet they may be covered under a different section. So it's important for people to take an inventory of what their damage is, to categorize it, and then to determine, based on that inventory of their damage, what policy applies to that particular damage claim, or if there is a claim. And I think knowing that, I think I can tell you from personal experience that having gone through that process, I think really helps to people to gain a sense of, I wouldn't say necessarily comfort, doesn't rise to that level, but I think it helps people to gain a better understanding of where they're situated.
And you're an attorney. Did you read your policies from top to bottom and all the fine print? In the days after the flood, I'm going to guess the answer is yes. And do other people need to do that? And if they don't want to do that or can't do that, what do they do?
Well, I think the very first thing, to answer your question, yes, I did. I read it from top to bottom. And you bring up a great point about gaining access to the policy. If many viewers are like me, what they did was they obtained flood insurance years ago. Well, what happens typically is that once you acquire flood insurance, you'll obtain the policy in year one. And if you renew in year 2, year 3, year 4, what happens is you get a more truncated, sort of a renewal notice, if you will. It's a little bit more elaborate than that, but basically it does nothing more than identifies the type of coverage you have, whether it affects the dwelling, whether it impacts contents, whether it contains debris removal, and also whether you paid a premium with respect to the potential for having to pay dollars out for increased cost of compliance. So I think what people will do is they'll look at their latest statement and realize that, oh, well, that doesn't really tell me what I need to know. The policy was actually issued, and the detail, it might be in a file that's several years old. But the solution to that is to simply pick up the phone, call your insurance agent through whom you gained your policy, and your insurance agent will be extremely helpful in obtaining that policy for you. That's the easiest solution.
And obviously, insurance agent would be one of the first people, if not the very first, that you should be contacting in the wake of this. And if you haven't already, and we assume that everybody has done that.
Correct. And you're right. And the language in the contract, the insurance contract, or the policy, I should say, usually anticipates that there would be a notification to the insurer, which would of course be channeled through the insurance agent, and that notification is typically required within 24 to 48 hours. Obviously, there are exceptions because the flood many times will knock out communications, put people in positions where they can't make a claim. But the expectation generally is as soon as you're able to make the claim, you should do so and inform the insurer. And it's actually to your benefit to do that because you get the ball rolling more quickly. Yes, I suspect that given that we're now 2 to 3 weeks removed from the actual storm date, most people will by now have contacted their insurance carrier, have notified them of their potential claim, and then have made arrangements for an adjuster to come out. Would you like to talk a little bit about in big picture terms? We can go into more detail about the components, but basically what typically happens once there's a notification.
Yeah, I think that talking about the process would be very beneficial. I think that at this point, many people have a pretty good handle on the process, and yet I'm surprised at how often that's not the case, and people continue to have questions about whether they're talking to the right people. And I know that if there are mortgages in the picture, it may well change, the adjudication process for the payment of insurance. And so maybe we can touch on, as you propose, some of these issues.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of the process, once the insurer has been notified, the insurer will send out an adjuster. And by the way, many of the adjusters that are sent out are not actual government employees. They're rather contractors that have been retained by FEMA to go out and basically make damage assessments. One important point that I'd like for our viewers to understand is that the adjusters, simply because they are very experienced in dealing with this, they do this full time, they will be very instrumental in helping people to put together a proof of loss claim. But the one key thing that our viewers should know is that the ultimate responsibility for making that proof of loss claim rests with the insured. So while the adjuster may help and actually may provide substantial help, the ultimate burden still rests with the insured to make sure all the documentation that accompanies that proof of loss is attached, and that it's timely filed. I think by now most people understand that the time period, which is typically 60 days for providing that, has now been extended to 1 year from the date of loss. Another point to mention to our viewers, Leonard, is that the date of loss may very well be different for our audience. It could be that some people were impacted early. It could be that some people were impacted only because there was water released from reservoirs. What we're not going to talk about today are inverse condemnation claims. It's a totally different ball of wax. That's a potential claim where someone might argue that the result of their flooding was not so much due to the storm, but rather to a decision by a governmental agency to release water to preserve the structural integrity of the
And in
reservoir.
specific, people who live in the attics in Barker area may be looking at this situation.
That's right. That's exactly right. But I think for today's conversation, we'll keep the discussion focused on those people that were affected by the flood damage itself. And by the way, that's another point that I think is skimmed over often, is that for FEMA coverage, the damage must be attributable directly to the flood. So if there are ancillary events that happen that are not directly tied to the flood, then technically those claims aren't the subject of damages for which a claim can be made. You mentioned the need to make sure that all parties that have an interest in the property are informed, and that is in fact a great point, because to the extent that, for example, you mentioned a mortgage company, to the extent that there are settlement amounts, a question that's been posed to me is whether or not settlement money that is provided by the government pursuant to a claim can be utilized not to rebuild the house, but rather to pay the mortgage. My understanding is that's a very reasonable, and in fact, the mortgage company would argue that they would be they might have subrogation rights to step into the insured's shoes to collect on that too. And sort of the notion there is that you've got a purchase money claim on the property. But the bottom line point for our viewers today is to make sure that not only is the insurer informed, but anybody that has an interest in the property or properties, if we're talking about content,
Such as a mortgage company,
mortgage
mortgage
company,
servicer, yeah.
or maybe even a finance company in the context of some item that might have been subject to a lien. Some people do that. They'll go out and buy a fair amount of appliances and then have those appliances.
And what about people with a home equity loan?
Same principle
Same
applies.
thing, or reverse mortgage.
Same principle applies.
So you're recommending full notification to all these entities.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the advantage, an additional advantage of doing that is that, believe it or not, you may not be the only one affected by the flood, and the parties with whom you are having these conversations may actually have information that may benefit you because they've done it 100 times over. So they may have practical practical considerations that you hadn't thought of.
So, in other words, lending institutions that may themselves have ownership or lien interests in your home may actually become beneficial partners in the process.
Absolutely. As we discussed just a minute ago, they actually have an interest in the property by virtue of that property being a purchase money security interest.
So let's say somebody has gone through most of the motions and they have filed their proof of loss claim, and maybe they've contacted their mortgage company, but they haven't called the appliance group or the bank that's got the home equity line. Should they pick up the phone today and call and say what?
They should first identify themselves as a flood victim. They should understand. They should communicate, particularly if they've not made a payment. There are many provisions for which there are. There may be cure provisions within their contracts. The most basic of which might be to simply make a payment toward a scheduled obligation, and that would cure a defect. My sense is that there are many companies that are sympathetic to the plight of homeowners that have been affected by the flood. But the important thing is to notify, and give the person or the entity with an interest in the property an opportunity to grant some form of relief.
Are you seeing any indication that mortgage lenders are granting any relief or delays in mortgage payments? Have you heard of such a thing happening here in the wake of Harvey?
That's a great question. I have not personally. Our situation is such that because we are a little later in life, we don't have a mortgage on our property, and I realize that that's not the case for many of our viewers. I don't know what banks as a whole are doing, and I suspect they may be taking each case on a case-by-case basis and assessing that person's ability to pay.
So let's talk a little bit about the structure of flood insurance. You've spent a lot of time on this on your own behalf and have gained a lot of insight about that. And just to give people a general overview, I think those who have been impacted probably know it very, very well, but I think it's always a good idea in these circumstances to give the generalities just in case. We may have viewers who watch this who aren't familiar with as much detail as they should be as homeowners.
Sure, I'd be happy to run through that. In general terms, a national flood insurance policy is administered by the government, and each policy has four major parts. Part A is the dwelling or the structure, as it may be referred to in the policy. Part B deals with contents, and by contents we mean general things that are sort of personal in nature: beds and tables and chairs, desks, sofas, that sort of thing. The third coverage element within a policy is for debris removal, And largely the types of things that are covered under that section are things that might have floated, for example, from a neighbor's yard into onto the insured's property. Well, that Part C of the policy covers the removal of that. And then Part D is what is called a increased cost of compliance coverage. And what that basically entails, Leonard, is if there is a circumstance where the cost to repair the dwelling is so substantial that it represents more than 50% of the value of the dwelling that is affected, and that's an important point. In terms of assessing the amount of damage relative to the property, the only thing that is counted is the value of the dwelling. So the value of the land is not counted for that purpose. But the point being that if there is substantial damage to the dwelling, then this provision may operate in conjunction with a local governmental agency, usually the city or a township, to declare that property out of compliance. And if the local agency, local municipality requires that dwelling be brought up to code that is above a certain base flood elevation, that's the term of art that's used. If it's required to be brought up into compliance, then this policy, Part D of the National Flood Insurance Policy, would kick in and contribute some, and it may not be all, but it would contribute some relief to the insured to help bring that dwelling into compliance. The current limit is now $33,300. Initially, it was $30,000, and that amount is indexed for inflation. So the current index adjusted amount is now $33,300.
So that means someone may have $33,000 if they have flood insurance coverage to come into to contribute toward coming into compliance according to their local municipality's definition of compliance.
That's correct.
Doesn't sound like a lot of money.
And it may not be relative to the cost of demolishing, raising a home, and carrying off the resulting pile, and then bringing the property up to a base level elevation. Another point about that, we're sort of touching on limits. You said it's not a lot of money, and I think that's a good segue into a discussion of limits. As I was going through parts A, B, C, and D, I didn't really touch on what those limits are. In general, Part A has a maximum limit of $250,000. That's per event. Whereas Contents has a $100,000 limit. There isn't really a separate limit for that debris component, but it's important to note that to the extent that there are payments that are made under Part C of the policy, any payments that are made under the policy count toward that $250,000 limit. Another important point for our viewers to know is that to the extent that there is money that's paid out under Part D, which is the increased cost of coverage, that also is subject to that $250,000 cap. In other words, if money is paid out for that, it reduces the amount that would otherwise be payable toward Part A coverage.
Which would reduce the Part A coverage down to $217,000 or something like
Right.
that. Yeah. And then there is a thing called the 50% rule that comes into play with regard to the question of compliance.
Yes, that's a great question, and that really should be viewed as the trigger. It is the mechanism for determining whether or not that particular coverage would apply. And the way that the 50%, what the 50% test is, again, is it's a test where the total damage resulting from a flood, not including damages that might result from, say, leaking in the roof, it has to be damage that is attributable to the flood water itself. If the cost of that exceeds is 50%, more than 50% of the value of the dwelling only, then the damage can be characterized as substantial. The reason that is important is that the city, in the case of Bel Air, for example, in conjunction with their relationship with the FEMA program, may be required to cause that homeowner to bring their house into compliance. And the practical rationale for that, Leonard, is that if you've got a house that's prone to flooding, the whole idea is, okay, guys, you've had a flood, so now, and if you're in a position where you may be subjected to another flood, and that flood can be avoided by virtue of bringing that house up to an elevation that gets it out of harm's way, then you should do that. One other a variation of the 50% test has not received a lot of attention. I'd like to talk about it because it can very well affect many of our viewers, and that's the situation where a homeowner has had multiple floods within a 10-year period. Under the terms of that Coverage D contract, if a person has had multiple floods, 2 floods within a 10-year period, if the average of those 2 damage amounts is more than 25% each, the idea being 2 times 25% gets you to 50%, then the effect of that is to trigger the substantial loss rule.
So they will aggregate the previous floods together if there have been 2 flooding incidents in the prior 10 years.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
So in your case, you
in our particular case,
well, let's see, Allison was in 2005, so you're just outside of the window. Is that how we would see that?
Right. Allison was actually a 2001 event, so it's completely outside of the 10-year window. But for those people that were caught up in, say, the Memorial Day flood or the Tax Day flood, for example,
especially the Meyerland area, for example.
Meyerland area would be particular residents of that community would have particular interest in this provision. But the point being that if they had multiple flood events within that 10-year period, and the aggregate cost to repair their dwelling counted on an aggregate basis reached more than 50% of the value of the home, then this substantial impairment designation would come into play.
And is it mandatory that the 50% rule trigger action by the municipality, or can municipalities waive the 50% rule? Is it a firm thing? And then also the issue of the valuation itself is somewhat fungible. I know we've had clients who began this process looking at their Harris County appraisal district valuation, and I think that maybe you'll speak to that. For all intents and purposes, that is not the thing to be looking at for this flood.
Right. You bring up some excellent points, Leonard, because remember, we have a tendency, because we're talking about the principal interaction between the flood insurer and the insured, and most of the communications are between those parties. We tend to forget that there's another party out there, and that's the municipality, which benefits from this relationship, and may receive some benefits from the National Flood Insurance Program. And in order to secure and maintain those benefits, that municipality will be required to require compliance with these base flood level elevation requirements. And you rightly point out that, as you know, being a financial advisor, valuation is sometimes art and sometimes science.
In the eye of the beholder.
It's in the eye of the beholder. So it may very well be that, yes, we have an objective test. The numerator is the cost to repair, and the denominator is the value of the house. Well, both of those values may be subjective. What is the value of a house? You point out the valuation that is. I would say it's a starting point to look to the HCAD values. But many municipalities, Bel Air included, would tell you that they have their own definition and their own way of assessing value. So it may be that the HCAD value may be too low, in which case, if for a homeowner that is caught in that situation where they're not inclined to want to move, and they don't want to be want their house designated as a substantially damaged dwelling, they may benefit from a larger valuation of the home. Conversely, the cost to repair can also be subjective, because you can have, as you know, people go out and shop for contractors, and you may have one contractor that says, well, the cost to do the repairs is X. A second contractor may say, well, actually the cost to repair the dwelling is actually X minus 1, or maybe X minus 2.
So people, in order to address this critical ratio of cost to repair to value of the structure, value of the dwelling, in the case of the numerator, they may get competitive bids and work their way through that process. In the case of the denominator, the value of the property, what recourse do they have to seek adjustments in that?
Well, let's talk about that in the context of our situation in Bel Air. The city of Bel Air has actually established a protocol, if you will, and they're asking people to come in and to meet with them to discuss their particular circumstances. And let's put this in proper perspective, Leonard. As of about a week ago, City of Bel Air had obtained an assessment as to the number of homes that had water in the living area, and the number at that point of homes that had water in them in Bel Air alone was 2,400. 2,400 residents in Bel Air. So, given that background, I think it's easy to see that if you were to dissect the homeowners and to say, well, where do those homeowners lie in terms of those homeowners that want to stay in their properties, and those and would be willing to do what they needed to do to stay in those properties, and then others who are ready to throw in the towel and say, guys, I'm not going to try to continue to live with my house at this at this base flood elevation. I want to do something about it. So you've got these two camps. The city has asked people to come in, and they don't want people to come in so early that they're not equipped. The city isn't equipped to deal with making decisions about what the city will do in terms of this designation. But they do want people to come in and talk to them once they're in a position where they've got some rough numbers. And the city will work with people to, in light of what it is that they want to do. And they may have access to the people that they can point to other contractors, and may say, well, yes, we understand that in your assessment of damages, you worked with this contractor. They're not in the position of directing people and telling people which contractor to use, but if it makes a difference in terms of whether they make an assessment that a dwelling is subject to this requirement, the homeowner may be happy to hear that from the city for purposes of getting someone below that 50% test. So it really depends on what the homeowner's individual situation is, and it depends on what they want to do on a go-forward basis.
And so people need to go in to the city, is that right?
Yes.
And strike up a conversation. Is that what you're recommending that they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there's a timing element at play here. You don't want to have that conversation too early, because the city can't help you, because the city does have to apply an objective test. What the city will have, of course, that would be beneficial. Of course, they have access to the same records you and I have access to, the public records that give people an indication of the value of the property. But what they don't have is an assessment of the value of the damage, and that's where it's incumbent upon the owner of the property to make some reasonable estimate about the range of damage that they think that they're going to have. And in some cases, that decision may not be difficult. If somebody had 5 or 6 feet of water in their house, and that affected their floors, their carpeting, their drywall, perhaps it impacted the structural components, the boards. It certainly would impact the insulation and electrical systems. That determination may not be too difficult to make. But for somebody else that had much less water in their house, that may be the type of situation where that would be truly beneficial for that homeowner to go in and talk to them.
And who has final say on the value of the structure, the denominator in this all-important ratio of cost to repair to value of the structure, which goes toward determination of the 50% rule? Who is it FEMA that's the final arbiter of that, or is it the city?
Well, ultimately, I think there are, and I don't mean to be coy about this, but I think that there are multiple arbiters at different stages. At the initial stage, for purposes of applying the test, the initial arbiter is the city, because it's incumbent upon the city to make a determination as to whether or not that dwelling is substantially damaged. And the next step beyond having internally made that decision is that there is a certificate that is completed by the city that's then provided to both FEMA and to the homeowner, that then becomes the basis for making the Part D claim. That claim cannot be made by a homeowner independent and without that certification.
And have you gotten your certification?
We have not. We are in the process of having having obtained some but not all of the estimates. And our house, because it is older, I think is particularly subjected to some differing estimates in terms of the valuation of the house. And we're looking closely at that rule that could impact us simply because we've encountered 2 floods within the last 10 years. So we've not yet approached the city, and what our intention is, Leonard, is to obtain at least one bid that gives us an indication of where we stand, and then at that point, even if we don't think that damage assessment is entirely complete, we think it's appropriate at that point to begin the dialogue with the city and to understand where they're coming from as well.
You're an attorney. Let's say somebody feels like they're really not well suited to handle this process, or they're hitting issues that they can't resolve with the city or with FEMA. Is there legal assistance available to people in those cases where they feel like the discussions they're having are not productive for their goals?
Yes, I think once, and there is a process, and a very formalized process for, if we're talking specifically about the substantial damage assessment, then the process would largely be discussions with the city, and there are processes by which you can have a form of arbitration, and in some respects it might boil down to having the dueling appraisers.
Yeah.
They come in with their own values, evaluations that can impact that decision one way or the other. But for that particular test, I'm not anticipating, Leonard, that there's going to be much controversy in those areas, considering that the city wants to work with its citizens. Bel Air, I can tell you, is bending over backwards in terms of trying to meet the needs of its citizens. So I think that more likely there can be controversy with respect to what is the amount of damages that for which a homeowner should be compensated under Part A. What's the cost to repair? What's the cost to put in my sheetrock and paint and put in either permanent carpeting or hardwoods, as was the case in our home.
Anything else we want to cover on the question of the NFIP, the flood insurance program, or the flood insurance in itself? I want to get to a discussion a bit about people who do not have flood insurance, but I want to make sure we don't leave this area if there's something else you want to add to the picture.
I would, I think we've covered a lot of the legal and financial aspects, and I would just say to our viewers, and this is really not so much a legal or a financial comment, and that's just to say, I know that this event is traumatic. It's a traumatic experience for a lot of people, and in spite of that, I would just have to ask you to kind of step back, take a deep breath, and remember that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that have been affected by the flood, and I would just ask that you, in light of that, try to elevate your level of patience. It is a long process, and it's going to be frustrating. You might be on the phone for 30 minutes, as we were, to get to a live person, only to be disconnected 1 minute into the conversation.
And that was calling FEMA? or your
yes,
insurance company?
that was calling FEMA. That was in the context of trying to gain an understanding of an extension in terms we're displaced. We've got some temporary housing, but it's not going to last forever. So we placed a call, and we're been put on hold for 30 minutes. We got to a live person, and 1 minute into the conversation, we're disconnected.
Is there some resource that you've been using that you particularly like for flood insurance policyholders?
Absolutely, and what I would tell you is this is like call it, choose your description, but it might be a battle, a war, a game, a lot of resources. And my advice is use every single resource at your disposal. And what you'll find is that as you encounter or have a discussion with an agency, they may not have the answer, but they can point you to someone that does. In our case, we have worked with I have worked with my local insurer that I have used. He has been a wealth of information and has been extremely helpful. You have your FEMA adjuster, and I would tell you stay in contact with your FEMA adjuster. That's vital, and understand too that FEMA adjusters, as they come out, they just because they come up with an estimate that may not be as high as what you had anticipated, they're not your enemy. They're out there trying to do a job, and if they miss something, again, try to be patient with them, point it out to them. And then, of course, there is a procedure where ultimately, if you can't reach an agreement with the adjuster himself, there's the normal process is elevated to the adjuster supervisor within the agency, or I'm sorry, the company that has been contracted with by FEMA to conduct the assessment. Just go up the chain. The adjuster supervisor. If the adjuster supervisor doesn't seem responsive, then go to the National Flood Insurance Examiner. And if the examiner still doesn't agree with you about that valuation, then there is a formal appeal process. And at that point, you're now dealing with folks in Washington, D.C.
Let's talk about those who do not have flood insurance. Do you know any numbers on those who flooded who do not have flood insurance? Have you heard any?
I have heard, and I don't have any objective information, but my understanding is that number was somewhere between 60 and 70% of the entire population affected by the flood that didn't have some form of flood insurance on their dwelling in particular. So, for example, that might be that someone might have carried insurance on their dwelling, but didn't carry content coverage. And another variation of asking the question that you just asked is even of those that are insured, how many were underinsured? They had contents that far exceeded the maximum, or had coverage that couldn't possibly cover the value of their homes. Because remember that there are maximums on those flood insurance coverage limits, and for some portion of our viewing audience, 250 isn't going to cover their
Make them whole. It's not going to make them whole.
Make them whole, right? But yes, I mean, in answer to your question, I've heard numbers as high as 60 to 70%.
So we could be dealing with an ongoing picture in Houston, which is really the great fear of everyone, that we have many, many people who do not have coverage for this event.
Absolutely, and that is a great segue to talking about, well, what do those folks do? A lot of our time thus far has been focused on the process and the procedure for somebody that is that has coverage through FEMA. But what about those folks that don't? and what I would tell you is that there are a number of resources out there, and they're not going to be nearly, of course, quite as necessarily as financially beneficial, but that nonetheless they're still out there. And one of the best resources that I found, Leonard, is the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross has a facility, and by their nature, that's what they do. They're sort of a non-governmental agency that's dedicated toward disaster. So there's a facility on the Southwest Freeway at 2700, and they've been a plethora of information. For example, they have, and I happen to have a little cheat sheet. I went by there and talked to them about what resources they could offer, not only ourselves but people that came in. What can a person expect if they walk through the doors? They have access to all the FEMA disaster recovery centers. They know exactly where they are. Katy Mills, Baytown Community Center, Greens Point, the distribution centers for where people can those that are so inclined can go get food and clothing and access to housing. Other resources are, our faith-based community. Leonard has really stepped up, and makes me proud to be a part of this city for that reason. Now, granted, these are organizations that do this without any formal affiliation with any of the agencies that we've just been talking about. They're not connected in any way to FEMA or to the Red Cross, but out of the goodness of their heart, they've set up, they've acted as drop sites for food that's coming in, that's brought in perhaps by the American Red Cross. I've got a list of 5 here that were provided to me by the American Red Cross.
And we will we'll give out information at the end of our presentation here, Michael, and maybe you could, if people have a question, they could email you and you could send them some of these sources that you have or that you recommend.
I would be happy to do that.
And then some other resources for those who are uninsured as well.
Well, and remember that although FEMA is a federal agency charged with the responsibility of administering the flood insurance program, they still have other potential grants. One of the things I did want to touch on, and I'll caveat this by saying I don't want a large portion of our community to gain a lot of or put a lot of reliance or expectation that this may happen, but given the sheer enormity of the homes that are affected, there have been grants that have been applied for by cities and townships, that the effect of which is to say to the government, what we would like to do is to have you come out and basically provide funds to this community so that we can buy these properties out. Now, what that means, Leonard, is that the homeowner is not going to be made whole. Let's make that perfectly clear. Even if the city were successful in obtaining these grants, and just so you know, in the past, I think the city of Bel Air has attempted to do that for some of its residents and wasn't successful. But again, I think what I have heard thus far is that the city has made the determination they're going to make these applications for these grants, the effect of which may be that there may be a few homes that may be bought out, and the price that we pay for that, of course, may not be fair value, but at least it'll put that party in a position where they are better off than they were in, having no hope of converting that house into into cash.
Now, the federal government has already injected, I think, $8 billion. I don't know if that money has been received. Under what program? Is that through a grant that has been made through FEMA?
Yes, and the government can infuse cash in a number of different ways, and we hadn't really touched on this, and I apologize for not doing that, but FEMA can provide an advance that ultimately it's not a settlement per se, but rather it can give money to people that know that they're going to be in a position where the adjusters come out and there's no question that there's substantial damage. Yes, the adjuster can provide funds and say, okay, we're going to give you an advance of $5,000, $10,000, whatever that number may be.
Is that a loan, or that's just an outright gift from the government?
Well, actually, it's an advance.
An advance.
It's an advance on the ultimate claim.
Okay.
So it's not in addition to the claim, but that's the number I think that you're alluding to. Remember at the onset, I don't know that we talked about this initially, but there were estimates of the total damages in our area being somewhere between 45 billion and 65 billion on the low end. And other high estimates maybe as high as 150 billion, but it's substantial. And so $8 billion in relation to those estimates is what that tells us, Leonard, is that we've only seen a fraction.
It's a drop in the bucket.
Relative to the
No
amount of money that will, yes, no pun intended, that will ultimately be coming back into the city.
Now, the mayor of Houston, I believe, has set up a fund, and there have been several other funds, and presumably people may want to get in touch with those efforts and get on the list there.
Absolutely. And as I said, this is one more reason for reaching out to folks like the Red Cross, the city, your local officials. Your local officials are charged with that responsibility to help advise the community of grants.
And we have to note this disaster didn't just end at the city of Houston's city limits or at the county's limits. Of course, it has
exactly right.
affected so many people across southeast Texas and into East Texas as well.
That's exactly right. We tend to talk about Houston and the Houston community as if there is one municipality, but as you know, we have many, many different townships. We talked about Houston, the city of Bel Air. We have the villages. We have Westview. We've got the Pearland community. Just a plethora of municipalities that have their own officials. They're charged with the responsibility of making residents aware of grants that are available.
Now, as we wrap up this discussion of uninsured, and then we're going to move to finish our discussion, there is the possibility of getting a disaster relief loan from the Small Business Administration. Would you talk a little bit about what that's all about?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and we start with the premise that that FEMA's charge to the public is to act as a federal emergency management agency. FEMA. That's what they do. They're not in the process of making loans. That's not what they're about. Now, having said that, the Small Business Administration does that. That's the core, or not the core, but it is a central benefit of the Small Business Administration. So people that are affected by the flood can apply for a loan through the Small Business Administration. Those loans are generally limited to about $200,000. One key benefit about those loans, Leonard, is that oftentimes those loans may come with interest rates that may be below market. So to the extent that a homeowner can qualify for those loans, then they may actually have a fairly nice, relatively affordable mortgage relative to what they might have had they gone out and tried to borrow the money through a purely private organization. Um, Now, I mentioned that they still have to qualify. Another key point there is that in order to, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but in order to qualify for those loans, people have to be current on their taxes. So they remember that the Small Business Administration is part of the administration, so they want to make sure that people have been compliant with their taxes. And it's incumbent upon people to make sure that they get caught up with their taxes if they haven't, because if they go in and apply for a loan and the Small Business Administration realizes that they're not current on their taxes, unfortunately that loan application process is going to be very short. So I would advise people to, notwithstanding the difficulty that they may be in, make sure that they're current on their taxes.
Real quickly, apartment dwellers.
Yes.
Also very important
Yes.
discussion about those who have
And
been affected and who are renting their homes.
Yes.
If you might give just a minute or so on their recourse and
Yes.
direction.
Yes, and I think this is an area where I think there's been a fair amount of confusion, and some people say, well, you can just automatically break your lease, and other people that say, well, no, you can't. Well, it depends on the circumstances. Of course, any landlord under Texas law in virtually every state in the country has got an obligation under the terms of the lease, when you sign up a lease, to provide a dwelling that is inhabitable. In other words, it's got to be a dwelling where the landlord offers to you a place to live, and it meets and it complies with certain standards, fundamental standards of living. You can't very well hold someone to a contract when the landlord says, well, yes, you signed this lease, and never mind the fact that you don't have running water, never mind the fact that you don't have the sewage system isn't working in our complex, but you've got to stay there. That's obviously, I'm being facetious now, but the point is, I do that just to illustrate the point that under those circumstances, the landlord couldn't possibly provide and offer an inhabitable dwelling. So under those circumstances, clearly the tenant has the ability, and I hate to use the phrase break the lease. They're not really breaking the lease. What they're simply doing is they're utilizing a provision, usually in the contract, that gives them the ability to go and find habitation where they can actually live in an inhabitable apartment. But on the other hand, I would caution those people that might have gotten a little bit of water in their kitchen. It maybe comes in, and I would caution people not to use that as an excuse to try to get out of a lease. That would clearly be bad faith, and I would recommend people not do that.
Now, commercial, those who have had commercial properties impacted, they will have their own private insurance.
Right.
I don't know if there are any issues there that you want to mention, and presumably if there are shortfalls, they too, and especially small businesses, would be looking to the SBA, perhaps,
Yes.
for assistance as well.
Yes, absolutely, and that brings up an entirely different additional considerations. There are loans that the SBA offers completely outside of the realm of what we've talked about thus far. It may be more the nature of like a working capital loan to help companies get back on their feet. There are loans that are based on not so much on lost profits per se, but the whole idea behind the loan is to give businesses access to funds that helps to get them back on their feet relatively quickly. And yes, the SBA is the source to go to for those types of loans. Of course, that doesn't preclude a, homeowner or business owner from going and seeking, um, you know, a line or a line of credit with perhaps if they have an existing banking relationship, then they should draw on that. And again, I've not, used this time to, because I personally have not had the need to do that. I've not gone and explored what the banks are doing. You asked that question earlier in our conversation. I'm not sure what the banking community is doing in terms of deferring payments but like with a lot of loans, if someone has a particular need and needs to go in and renegotiate their loan, I suspect the banks will be very willing to do that. I suspect that they've probably got a substantial number of people that will be knocking on their doors to do that.
And then I think finally, you are a CPA. I don't know if you are knowledgeable about the details of what the IRS has undertaken in terms of extensions for filing deadlines.
Yes, I am a CPA, and I am familiar with what the IRS has done. But in a nutshell, the largest or the most significant relief has been in the form of an additional extension on 2016 filings that otherwise would have been required to have been filed in September.
Due around now.
Around September 15th. We're now past September 15th. But also those returns that would have been due October 15th. What the IRS has done with respect to returns that were already extended to those dates is to grant an extension of those returns to January 31st of 2018.
So if your 2016 returns had been extended and due September 15 or October 15, you now have until January 31st of next year, 2018.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. There are, as a practical matter, I think there's still significant incentive for taxpayers to try to get their taxes done as early as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not encourage taxpayers. Now I'm talking about taxpayers and not homeowners, but I would encourage taxpayers to get their filings in as soon as possible, because January comes upon you like a bandit.
Yeah.
And at that time, then they'll be dealing with 2017 filing requirements.
And I think there's an extension maybe to estimated payments as well.
That's correct. And to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, some very small abatements on penalties for late deposits and that sort of thing. But that's right. So the timing for those tax deposits has also been extended to January 31st of 2018. And I think, given that we are roughly just past the middle of September, I think that will be a very welcome relief for a lot of people. I think the storm has had the effect of creating this aura of disorientation, and I think people just need a few weeks to kind of get back on their feet, get back in a routine of doing the things that they have done. And certainly the IRS, I think, recognizes that, and so their additional extension is very welcome.
Michael, I want to thank you very much for your time today and all of your insights, and I hope that our viewers will agree that it's been helpful and we'll get some value out of it. If people would like to reach you, you have a website that if you would give that out.
Yes, it is www.sanchezbusinesslaw.com.
So sanchezbusinesslaw.com. And we at New Capital are reachable at newcapitalmgmt.com, newcapitalmgmt.com. And I know I speak for Michael when I say I hope that everybody is doing as best as they can and recovering as best as they can from the flood I think that the city has really pulled together enormously well, and the volunteer efforts on the part of many, the financial efforts and the assistance that's come in, not only from here in our region, but really from all over the country and even all over the world. I know that many organizations that I'm affiliated with have been astonished at the money that has come into them from outside of the Houston area, and it's very heartening to see that assistance. And we will see how the city continues to recover and what changes are made. But in the meantime, we hope that everybody is doing the best they can, and we wish all of you out there the best. Thanks for taking the time to watch our video. Take care.
Thank you, Leonard.